In Malaysia, issues related to the indigenous land are often the main issues that is often discussed in the mass media, where the land is said to have been invaded and logged on a large scale. This situation is due to the existence of certain parties such as orang asli customary land is not recognized and protected by the federal and state governments. The issues of this indigenous land has never been debated in parliament. However, these indigenous people live in the forest areas, so the rights related to the indigenous people's customary land themselves are still poorly clarified under the Orang Asli Act 1954, and they are still facing oppositions to matter related to their land ownership, which is taken at their will. It's clear that this issue has been going on for many years until now, and there are actions that have been taken by the Malaysian government in order to protect and adopt the UN Declaration as a purpose a national inquiry into the issues of Orang Asli land.
The constitutions of indigenous land is one of the issues that is always brought up in the case of indigenous lands. As a result, the Orang Asli act as a guardian of their lands, particularly for future generations. Loss of such lands means loss of identity. Furthermore, Orang Asli settlements were destroyed during these periods to make way for development projects such as Kuala Lumpur International Airport (KLIA), highway, Institute of Higher Learning, dam, golf course, and several private developments. The Orang Asli were not compensated in any way for the loss of their lands.
The first is from the Suhakam Agency and also experts including the UN Special Reporter who will review the main obstacle to realizing land right. Further, the agency involved are also from the development of indigenous people, namely Chako, who often collaborate with government agency that will represent their agency as indigenous people. The third is the agency of the native themselves who act as guardian or custodians of their land intended to the land for the future generation, because the loss of the land signifies them losing their identity. For the last but not least is the involvement of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs as well as the police, whose role is to expel and prevent unauthorized and malicious persons from entering the Aboriginal area.
Among the acts used in the issues of confiscation of indigenous land right are the Indigenous People Act 1954 and the Human Rights Commission Suhakam, which aim to safeguard the interests and protection of the right of indigenous people, as well as the United Nations also provide the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous People (UNDRIP) that pay attention to the right of indigenous people including Orang Asli. In addition, the Act also provides for areas Orang Asli and Orang Asli reserve land declared by the party state authority. The next is Section 64 of the National Land Code 1965 allow the cancellation of any reserve area. Therefore, Orang Asli have no statutory right to their land. This is because indigenous people are often accused of encroaching on the government land even though they have long settled on the land. However, subsequent Act have shown that indigenous people will receive compensation from the government in accordance with the following Act, namely based on Section 11 and 12 of the Act Orang Asli 1954. Any compensation pursuant to this section is above discretion of the authority to decide the amount of compensation to be paid to Orang Asli, as there are no guidelines for set it.
The government and the authorities need to make some amendments to the law of Malaysia in strengthening the position of the indigenous people and their lands. The Indigenous People Act 1954 need to be amended to include the definition of Orang Asli area, Orang Asli customary lands, and the division of their estate, taking into account the satisfaction of the Orang Asli. That is the recommendation of the Orang Asli, and their concern need to be taken into account before amending this Act. In addition, the National Land Code 1965 also need to be amended to include provision on Orang Asli land, as this Act does not touch on the indigenous people and their lands. In conclusion, it is amenable that the authorities concerned about the position of the Orang Asli and their problem. Authoritative bodies such as the Government of Malaysia and the United Nations perform their duties by taking reasonable action in defending the land right of the Orang Asli. But the Malaysia government effort must be increased in protecting the right of the indigenous people to their lands. The protection provided specifically for the Orang Asli are expected to protect the right of the indigenous people and their lands.